Hi folks, this is going to be part 1 of chapter 30, Sensory Perception. Animals use sensory systems to receive signals from inside and outside the body. They then decode them and become aware of touches, sounds, sights, odors, and other sensations. Whales use sound to communicate, locate food, and find their way around underwater. Some whales are capable of echolocation, which means that they are going to send out some sort of signal. That signal will then bounce off of fish and other organisms, which will help the whale locate those fish. Others use low pitched sounds that travel along the ocean basin. If you guys ever watched Finding Nemo, you probably remember when Dory was trying to sing to the whales. Whales rely heavily on their sense of hearing, and underwater sound pollution puts them at risk. Unfortunately, a lot of times the shipping industry creates a lot of sound pollution underwater. 16 whales beached themselves when the U.S. Navy tested a new sonar system, and autopsies revealed blood in their ears and an acoustic fat. Ships and sonar systems are adding noise pollution to our oceans, leading to more beached whales. So this whole chapter is all about detecting stimuli and forming perceptions. So the sensory portion of a vertebrate's nervous system, remember we are vertebrates because we have a spinal cord that contains vertebra, but the vertebrate nervous system consists of sensory neurons that detect stimuli and nerves that carry information about the stimulus to the brain and brain regions that process the information. So a stimulus is a form of energy that a sensory receptor detects. And there's various types of energy, including light, sound, movement, chemical, and heat. Different types of sensory neurons respond to different specific stimuli by producing action potentials. Remember, action potentials is that electricity that travels along the nerve's axon. The types of sensory receptors include chemoreceptors, thermoreceptors, pain receptors, mechanoreceptors, and photoreceptors. Chemoreceptors are sensory receptors that respond to a chemical, and usually find these chemoreceptors lining the nose and the mouth. So when you're smelling or tasting something, you're using your chemoreceptors. Thermoreceptors, those are receptors that detect temperature, and they're usually found in the skin. And then pain receptors are sensory receptors that respond to tissue damage. We also have mechanoreceptors. These are sensory receptors that respond to pressure, position, or acceleration. And you have photoreceptors, and these are sensory receptors that respond to light and are usually found in the eye. There are 3 variables that allow your brain to evaluate incoming action potentials and determine the location and intensity of a stimulus. Remember, action potentials is that electricity, that is your nerve firing off. 1, the nerve that delivers the action potential. So what nerve is actually delivering the action potential is something the brain needs to determine. For example, the optic nerve delivers info about light. Then the frequency of the action potential. So the more that nerve is firing off, or the higher the frequency would be, the stronger the stimulus. And then finally, the number of sensory receptors that are firing. So again, if you've got more nerves firing, then that will increase stimulus intensity. A great example that I like to use is in the optic nerve. So let's say you were watching a movie in class, and then all of a sudden the teacher flips the lights on and it gets really bright. Your eyes are going to tell the brain, hey, it's really bright here. And so what's going to happen is the optic nerve is going to deliver information that the room got really bright fast. And because it got bright so fast, you're going to have a high frequency because that light is so strong. And then all the photoreceptors in your eyes are going to be firing off to the brain at the same time. Hey, it's bright. And then what your brain will do will send a signal back to help you close your eyelids and filter out some of that light. Another example would be in action potentials from a mechanoreceptor in the skin. The stronger the pressure, the more action potentials per second. So for example, if you lightly pinch your skin, you won't really notice anything, right? Like your brain says, yeah, you're pinching your skin. Now, if you pinch the skin really hard, then more action potentials from the mechanoreceptors are going to fire off because it's going to hurt. The mechanoreceptors deliver a touch signal to the brain. The harder you press, the more action potentials or signals are going to get sent to the brain, and also more sensory receptors will fire if you press even harder. And so your brain will definitely know that something is going on. Stimulus duration also affects your response. So, continued stimulation of receptor can lead to something called sensory adaptation, in which sensory neurons cease firing and spike continued stimulation. For example, if you're wearing clothing right now, can you feel the shirt you're wearing or your underwear? Probably not. When you initially put on your clothing, you're going to have signals from your skin receptors saying, hey, there's fabric touching me. But then after a prolonged amount of time, you're going to forget that you're wearing clothes. So sensory adaptation is the slowing or cessation of a sensory receptor's response to an ongoing stimulus. Examples: if you walk into a house where an apple pie is baking, you're initially going to be overwhelmed with the scent of the apple pie. It might make you really hungry. But then after a few minutes, you're going to get used to that smell and you're not going to notice the smell of apple pie anymore. That's called sensory adaptation. Sensation and perception. Sensation is the detection of sensory signals. Perception arises when the brain assigns meaning to those signals. So, sensation is literally the detection of a stimulus. Perception is when your brain actually gives that sensation meaning. So, another way to remember this: sensation. This is the process by which our sensory receptors and nervous system receive and represent stimulus energy from our environment. Basically, sensation is the brain receives input from a sensory organ. So it's receiving light from your eyes, or maybe it's receiving a signal from your nose or your mouth. Perception is the process of organizing and interpreting sensory information, enabling us to recognize meaningful objects and events. This is when your brain makes sense of the input from the sensory organ and puts a meaning to it. So it'll say, ooh, it's really bright out, or oh, that tastes really good. A great example would be if you've ever seen someone prank someone else where they're sleeping and you take a feather and you start touching their ear with it. That person their brain is going to receive a signal that says that there's something on their ear, but they're not going to know that it's a feather. They're going to think it's a bug or something else. And so that person will swat at their ear. And then finally, when the person awakes, they'll put a perception to it and realize that it's actually not a bug and it's a feather that's being used to stimulate their ears. So, key concepts. Sensory systems consist of sensory receptors and nerves that carry signals and brain regions that receive and process a sensory input. Each type of sensory receptor reacts to a specific stimulus, and information about stimuli is encoded in the number and frequency of action potentials, or how often the nerve is firing off. There's two types of sensations I expect you guys to know, and those are somatic sensations and visceral sensations. Our brain easily identifies the source of somatic sensations such as touch on skin, but visceral sensations originate from receptors in walls of soft organs and are less easily pinpointed. So how do you remember this? Somatic sensations are sensations such as touch and pain that arise when sensory neurons in skin, muscle, or joints are activated. These are sensations that you can easily point to and say, I cut my finger, it hurts. A visceral sensation is a sensation that arises when sensory neurons associated with organs inside the body are activated. These would be things like hunger pains, cramps, or gas pains. So sometimes when you go to the doctor and they say, where does it hurt? And you're just pointing to your abdomen or your stomach, it's going to be really hard for the doctor to understand exactly what's going on. That's considered a visceral sensation. The human primary somatosensory cortex is a narrow strip of cerebral cortex that runs from the top of the head to just above the ear. And what's really cool about this somatosensory cortex is that each part of it is connected to a different part of your body. So you can see here this picture of the somatosensory cortex, and you can see that like each part of your body actually has a spot on that part of the cortex. And what happens here is that the somatic sensory signals from receptors in skin and skeletal muscles reach sensory areas in the cerebral cortex where interneurons are organized like maps of individualized body parts. And so every time you taste something really good, or you burn your tongue, or your tongue gets really cold, then this part of your brain is what is going to light up. Sensory receptors report to the somatosensory cortex about touch, pain, and temperature. The fourth somatosensory sense is muscle sense, which relates to positioning of body parts. So if you've ever done yoga and something hurts, or the yoga instructor says you need to lift your butt up more or move your leg, that would be that somatosensory sense. Muscle spindles and mechanoreceptors near joints and tendons contribute to muscle sense. The more a muscle stretches, the more frequently the receptors fire. So if you twist your arm or leg in the wrong direction or pull a muscle, it's going to be those mechanoreceptors that are going to fire off. Pain. Injured or distressed body cells release local signaling molecules called histamines or proglandins that stimulate neighboring pain receptors. You have various neuromodulators like endorphins that lessen pain, or P, which increases the feeling of pain. So pain is the perception of tissue injury due to lack of blood flow, muscle spasm, overstretching of an organ. Think about when you eat too much and your stomach really hurts, that would be considered pain. So what should you know? You should know the difference between somatic and visceral sensation. Somatic sensations include touch, pressure, pain, and temperature and muscle sense, usually coming from the outside of the body, whereas visceral sensations would be various sensations coming from inside the body. They start at mechanoreceptors in skin, muscles, and near the joints, and visceral sensations arise from stimulation of receptors in the walls of soft internal organs. Now we're going to talk about the eye. Most animals are sensitive to light, but only those with a camera eye form images as humans do. So we have a camera eye. Eyes are sensory organs that contain a dense array of photoreceptors, and they also contain pigment molecules and photoreceptors that absorb light energy, which is converted to action potential and sent to the brain. So, all eyes contain lenses. So, vision requires eyes and a brain with the capacity to interpret the visual stimuli. And the formation of an image requires an eye with a lens. So, your lens is going to be the transparent disc shaped structure that bends light rays so they fall on the eye's photoreceptors. So, you guys can see here, this is considered the lens. There are two types of eyes, compound eyes and camera eyes. Some invertebrates, that means organisms without a backbone, such as earthworms, have something called photoreceptors, but they do not have eyes. Many insects have compound eyes, and here's an example of an insect with compound eyes, which with many individual units, each with a lens. So this insect, if it's looking at some trees, this is the image it would look like. So each dot on this eye is going to take an image. Vertebrates, such as us, have camera eyes with an adjustable opening that lets in light and a single lens that focuses the light on a photoreceptor-rich retina. So, compound eyes are eyes with many units having its own lens, such as this praying mantis. Camera eyes is an eye with an adjustable opening. Think about us, our eyes have adjustable openings, and a single lens that focuses light on a retina. And a retina is a layer of the eye that contains the actual photoreceptors. So we already know this. The eyeball is spherical and it has a 3-layered structure. The outer layer includes a transparent cornea and white sclera. If you guys ever hear about someone scratching their cornea and they've got like a really red eye, that means they've scratched the outer layer of their eye. Then you have a middle layer. Your middle layer includes a dark layer, a ciliary body, and 2 internal chamber lenses called the iris and the pupil. So this is your iris and this is your pupil. And then your innermost layer is going to be your retina, and this is where all your photoreceptors hang out. So the cornea is a clear protective covering at the front of the vertebrae eye. Your iris is a circular muscle that adjusts the shape of the pupil to regulate how much light enters it. If you ever hear someone say, oh my gosh, you have such pretty brown eyes or green eyes or blue eyes, they're talking about your iris. So your iris is the colored part of your eye. It is the muscle that is going to control the size of your pupil. Your pupil is the black part of your eye. So if you look in the mirror right now and you see the colored part of your eye, that's your iris. And then the pupil is the dark part of your eye, and that's what's going to allow light in. That's why your pupils get really small in bright light and really big when it's dark out. And what controls the size of your pupil is your iris. Visual accommodation is the altering of lens shape to focus on objects at different distances. So what happens is if you are driving and you need to see something from far away or up close, you will have the contraction of muscles which will help focus the lens for reading, and relaxation allows the lens to flatten for distance vision. So, visual accommodation is the process of making adjustments to lens shape so light from an object falls on the retina. And the image on the retina is upside down and reverse left to right, and the brain interprets the image. And if you click on this YouTube video, it's a fabulous Bill Nye, the Science Guy video, which explains more about how visual accommodation works as well as how your pupil and retina work. So your retina has two types of photoreceptors. Remember, your retina is in the back of the eye, and those are rods and cones. And I expect you guys to know the difference between rods and cones. And these rods and cones are what are going to fire off to the brain what you're seeing. Visual pigments called opsins are derived from vitamin A, which is why vitamin A deficiency can impair vision. If you guys remember hearing from your mom or dad or your grandparents that you should always eat your carrots because they're good for your eyes, that's because carrots are high in vitamin A. So like I said, there are two types of photoreceptors in the retina. You have rod cells and you have cone cells. Rod cells detect dim light and are concentrated at the edges of the retina. The rods have the same pigment, which is most excited by exposure to green or blue light. The way I remember this is rod cells are what are going to detect like grainy images in dark rooms when you're first waking up. So rod cells are photoreceptors that are active in dim light and provide coarse perception of image and detect motion. Cone cells are photoreceptors that provide sharp vision and allow the detection of color. So cone cells are most active during the day, and they are most abundant in the part of the retina called the fovea, and this is just the retinal region where cone cells are most concentrated. So rods and cones lie at the very rear of the retina beneath layers of signal processing neurons, and when a rod or cone photoreceptor absorbs light, signals flow to the neuron in the layer above, which process the signal and send them to the brain. Signals from the visual field of each eye travel along the optic nerve to the brain's opposite hemisphere. So your left eye, whatever it sees, that signal is going to be sent to your right side of your brain. And in your right eye, whatever you're seeing, that will be sent to the left side of the brain. Once the signals are received in the brain, the visual cortex is where the final integration process produces visual sensations and you get the final product. Key concepts. Vision requires eyes with a dense array of photoreceptors and a brain that integrates signals from them. The vertebrate eye works like a film camera. A single adjustable opening lets in light, and that adjustable opening would be your pupil, and your iris is what's adjusting that opening. And a sensory pathway starts at the eye's retina and ends in the visual cortex of the brain.